University. He specializes in Central European, Middle Eastern relations, in interreligious relations, and historical linguistics. And his topic is quite difficult to translate, and also its content is difficult, but you will speak about it, not I. From binationality through genocide and expulsion to national purity, the Czech script as a model for Israel. Okay? I hope you will calm down the audience.
Thank you.
Okay.
The organizers.
Into the microphone.
Of course, thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers of this event. First of all, let me read the name of my lecture in Hebrew for you. מדו-לאומיות, דרך ג'נוסייד וגירוש, לטוהר לאומי, התסריט הצ'כי, כמודל לישראל. Okay. So you may well put a question mark there at the end. This picture also has some interesting content. You may notice that it was taken yesterday. It's from the area of the Yerida Mizrach, the 1930s fairground in North Tel Aviv, and next to the Israeli flag on a whole row of flags was put the Czech flag, except it's the wrong way around. In many ways, Czechoslovakia was a sister state of Yugoslavia. And this lecture has three strains. The first strain of the lecture is the history of comparison between the Bohemian lands and the Holy Land. There is actually a history of comparison from the 19th century until today, as reflected in the works of historians, literary figures, and politicians. There are in fact hundreds of comparisons like that. Second, this comparison is tested for accuracy. The real historical links are highlighted as well as contrasted with collective memory, with focuses on binationalism, on arms shipments from Czechoslovakia to Israel around 1948, and on policies of what I call nation cleansing. And third, there is an extrapolation into the future. This is something we historians rarely do, and we will attempt it. If Israel would indeed try to become like the Czech Republic today, what is the path to get there? Could this model work? And is it worth it? This contribution explores how the Bohemian lands, a conglomerate of linguistically and religiously mixed Habsburg Austrian provinces, Bohemia, Moravia, and Southeast Silesia, turned into an exemplary nation-state within less than a century. I'm talking about the 20th century. Indeed, today's Czech Republic is the incarnation of a nationalist's dream. Virtually the entire population of the country is Czech, and there are almost no Czechs living outside the Czech Republic. Here is a near-perfect congruence between nation and state, which is perhaps the aspiration, but not the reality of most countries in the world today. But at what price? At home, Czech nationalism was confronted with opposition to Czech domination, or even to nationalism per se, very much like in Bosnia. In terms of domestic policies, there were many competing alternative attempts of state or nation building on the same territory, in the Bohemian lands and all over Czechoslovakia, notably German and Slovak attempts, as well as strong local linguistic syncretisms, mixtures. The competition between various nationalisms was expressed in the breakups of Czechoslovakia, there were several, but also in massive and sometimes mutual nation cleansing, which eradicated for the most part traditional syncretism, such as Czech-German bilingualism. The eradication of Jews, partly through collaboration in the Holocaust, and the expulsion of German speakers after World War II, were followed by 4 decades of totalitarianism, with tens of thousands of Czechs and Slovaks murdered and hundreds of thousands driven into exile. To this, we may add economic decline and environmental destruction, as well as military invasion and occupation after 1968. This development could have been prevented. Bernard Bolzano, an early 19th century Catholic theologian and philosopher at Prague University, suggested in his time to merge Czech and German speakers in Bohemia, perhaps even linguistically, into one nation. Possibly influenced by this, Karl Egon Ebert, a Prague German Christian intellectual, wrote the following poem in 1835, and I quote, "Thus, firs, peacefully let the oaks stand at your side, and also you oaks, brothers shall see in the firs. So you will strengthen each other, harmonious in alliance. What was united by God the Lord should not be undone by an earthly hand." End quote. The forest was a widespread metaphor of the people, in quotation marks. The oak was already a common allegory specifically for Germans. And the fir was apparently supposed to represent Czechs here, although later the linden tree would become the Czech national tree. Ebert's mixed deciduous and coniferous forest, so typical for the landscapes of Central Europe, was thus an allegory for a mixed German and Czech Bohemia. Religion, specifically Christian religion, was supposed to function as a unifying bond, and mutual benefit was to be the reward for tolerance and brotherhood. However, after the failed revolution of 1848, with the peak of Czech-German Christian binationalism in the Bohemian lands, the nationalist conflict gradually escalated, with open, all-out national riots rocking the Bohemian lands by the end of the 19th century. Instead of a Christian Czech-German alliance, a much reduced Czech-German-Jewish alliance emerged. This made sense specifically in Prague, where a very large percentage of German speakers were Jewish. Here, an example by German-Jewish young Bohemian intellectual Leopold Kompert from 1848. Note that the name Honza here is a generic name for Bohemia and Moritz for Jews, in reference to Jan or Honza Hus and Moses Moshe Rabbeinu. And I quote, "Do you know Honza, whose history Bohemia reminds me of?" Moritz asked. "No one's," Honza replied proudly. "Yes, it does. It is very similar to the history of the Jews." Honza burst out laughing. "Do you have a Hussite general like Jan Žižka?" he exclaimed. "Do you have the Hussites?" "Oh yes," Moritz said, "we have the Maccabees." He saw the struggle for goodness and freedom and independence. His own feelings echoed it. Jerusalem and Bohemia. End of quote. Indeed, literary scholar Peter Demetz credited Kompert with being, and I quote, "the first Jewish writer of Bohemia who formulated the problem of his Jewish nation or folk in modern sharpness as an independent question, and inserted it into the constellation of the German-Czech contrast." End of quote. The same rhetoric was adopted also by the Czech Jewish assimilationist movement, which emerged in the 1870s and was documented by Hillel Kivel. Moreover, this rhetoric was adopted by the Zionist movement, which spread in Bohemia following the infamous Pilsner trials. After World War I, British Palestine presented Prague Zionists with what Dmitry Shumsky called, and I quote, "some sort of second opportunity to prove in principle that the deconstruction of multinational frameworks to create ethnic nation states is not the only realistic option." End of quote. Franz Kafka's famous Czech-German-Arab-Jewish projections, without fixed roles and changing implications, have been traced in detail by Atef Botros. It should be noted that also Franz Werfel's famous book on the genocide of Armenians, Musadag, was really a multi-layered network of transferences that included, in addition to the four groups mentioned above, Czechs, Germans, Arabs, and Jews, also Turks and Armenians. Indeed, throughout the interwar period, Czech, German, Jewish, Arab, and sometimes yet more complex nationalist minority-majority analogies were produced en masse. For example, by assimilationist Czech Jews, Czechoslovak Zionists, Czech Christian sympathizers, and international Zionists. Moreover, these analogies, although employed by a plethora of different groups, were sometimes all but indistinguishable. Frank Hadler introduced the term architecture of comparison, or in German, Vergleichsarchitektur, finding that Czechoslovak, Hungarian, and Polish national traumata, in quotation marks, of being parceled up by neighboring states were actually constructed along similar lines. Poland's partition trauma was weighed against Hungary's Trianon trauma and Czechoslovakia's Munich trauma. History was divided into before and after. This architecture of comparison was employed already by contemporary political actors using the well-established binational analogies between Czechoslovakia and British Palestine for propaganda or publicity purposes. A fortnight before the Munich conference in mid-September 1938, Adolf Hitler turned up his anti-Czech agitation, comparing Czechoslovakia's German speakers to Palestinian Arabs. And I quote, "I am in no way willing that here in the heart of Germany, through the dexterity of other statesmen, a second Palestine should be permitted to arise." End of quote. After the Munich analogy, a so-called Czech Holocaust was constructed to continue the alleged parallels between Czech and Jewish so-called small nation nationalism, which now increasingly froze into a clear pattern of Czechs equaling Jews and Germans equaling Arabs. A closer look at the actual victim numbers of the Holocaust, however, reveals a slightly different picture. Czechoslovak historiography usually indicated the number of Czechoslovak victims of Nazi Germany as roughly 360,000. Yet a breakdown of this figure shows that the vast majority of these victims were Jewish. Livia Rotkirchen and Yeshayahu Jelinek traced what appeared to be among Europe's highest level of local Czech fascist and specifically Slovak fascist collaboration. After World War II and the Holocaust, the Czechoslovak-Zionist relationship, which included exile diplomacy and wartime propaganda, moved towards a Czechoslovak-Soviet-Israeli diplomatic and secret military cooperation. During Israel's War of Independence around 1948, mainly leftover arms originally produced for the Nazi German army in the Bohemian Moravian so-called protectorate were then sold and delivered to Israel. This is the historical pinnacle of Czech-Jewish relations, although it has often been suppressed in collective memory. This entire military cooperation, which included many facets, establishes Czechoslovakia as Israel's founding state, or at least as one of them, with Britain and the Soviet Union playing major roles as well. In addition, Prague helped with the movement of about 200,000 Jewish survivors from other countries to the DP camps, and after the Israeli War of Independence, with a partial expulsion of Palestinian Arabs, nearly 20,000, or about half of Czechoslovakia's own remaining Jewish survivors, emigrated to this country. Prague further hosted at that time Joseph B. Schechtman, a revisionist Zionist specialist for population movements, in quotation marks, and an OSS, later CIA, consultant. Over the next 2 decades, Schechtman published several tracts on population transfers with comparisons of Czechoslovakia's so-called transfer of German speakers and Israel's so-called transfer of Palestinians. In one such book, Schechtman quoted Czechoslovak President Edvard Beneš describing transfer as, and I quote, "a grim necessity." Notwithstanding the rather significant differences, Notwithstanding the rather significant differences between the Czechoslovak and the Israeli population transfers, in quotation marks, in 1945 to 49, the analogies of Czech-Jewish national friendship continued in this light via 1967 to 68 into the 2000s. The three central themes of the Czech-Jewish friendship were still the fight for statehood of a small nation, the ostensible struggle against continued attempts of so-called extinction, and the quotation marks transfer policies. Czechoslovakia lent Israel the metaphor of an Israeli Munich and a strong, if doubtful, legal precedent for population transfer. In return, Israel allowed Czechoslovakia to present itself as a fellow victim of the Nazi genocides and claim a largely fictional Czech Holocaust. This helped Czechoslovakia to cover up wartime collaboration. It further helped to diplomatically and politically justify the re-establishment of Czechoslovakia after World War II and Prague's minority expulsions. Czech public figures enthusiastically joined in this revival of the Czech-Jewish or Czechoslovak-Israeli analogy in the Middle East. In 2002, Czech Prime Minister Miloš Zeman, who has recently been elected Czechoslovakia's president, a social democrat, compared Hitler and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat in the context of the Oslo Accords. Zeman further claimed, and this is a quote, "We have a shared fate. You Jews were step one of the Holocaust and the Nazi plan. The genocide of the Czechs was supposed to transpire in step two." End of quote. After Arafat died in 2004, parallels to the Munich Agreement were again widely discussed, but now the analogy was moved to Iran and its belligerent new president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. In September 2011, just before a Palestinian attempt of gaining recognition for a partial statehood at the United Nations, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu extensively reviewed Czech-Jewish ties. And this is a small excerpt. "We've always thought of the Czech Republic and the quote, "We've always thought of the Czech Republic and the Czech people as a great friend, but this friendship has now blossomed into an extraordinary relationship. We're cooperating in every way. We cooperate mainly in the field of values. I think this is the deepest thing. We have almost a common DNA, perhaps because of a common historical experience of a small feisty democracy often surrounded by undemocratic foes that has to fight both for its freedom and for the truth." If we polemically extrapolate this ubiquitous Czech-Jewish analogy, viewing nationalism as a program that will often run its full bitter course, on the basis that Zionism started nearly a century after Czech nationalism, we could imagine the following future. In 2023, Tel Aviv Jaffa's old central bus station, now located in an upscale luxury district full of tourists, is opened as the city's Black Museum to commemorate the culture of Sudanese and Eritrean Christian and Muslim refugees, which were delivered to the persecutors, with perhaps tens of thousands murdered through Israeli collaboration in the preceding decade. At the festive opening, guest speakers from the Czech Republic might mention some striking historical parallels to the story of Prague's famous Jewish Museum, founded during the ghetto gentrification in the early 20th century in Prague. Or else, in 2071, the first Israeli democratically elected Prime Minister David Dankner, perhaps the descendant of a wealthy old Israeli family and a Hebrew playwright, who spent several years in Israel's infamous Oz political prison in the Negev under the totalitarian regime, publicly apologizes for the expulsion of all Muslims and Christians from the Holy Land in the 2040s. The Czech press celebrates Dankner as the Israeli Václav Havel, who became Czechoslovakia's first democratically elected president after the end of communism and famously apologized for the expulsion of German speakers from his country. Please allow me to conclude this lecture with a quote by political philosopher Michelle Moody Adams. "The The openness of human social groups towards the future, indeed their very survival, is dependent on their ability not to suppress all internal conflicts, but sometimes to take those conflicts as an occasion to renegotiate a new and more exclusive cultural identity. Thank you very much.